the new god of authority, the new gods of authority, a new god of authority, the new goddess of authority, the new goddesses of authority, a new goddess of authority, the old god of authority, the old gods of authority, a old god of authority, the old goddess of authority, the old goddesses of authority, a old goddess of authority, the greater god of authority, the greater gods of authority, a greater god of authority, the greater goddess of authority, the greater goddesses of authority, a greater goddess of authority, the lesser god of authority, the lesser gods of authority, a lesser god of authority, the lesser goddess of authority, the lesser goddesses of authority, a lesser goddess of authority, the greater spirit of authority, the greater spirits of authority, a greater spirit of authority, the lesser spirit of authority, the lesser spirits of authority, a lesser spirit of authority, the major god of authority, the major gods of authority, a major god of authority, the major goddess of authority, the major goddesses of authority, a major goddess of authority, the minor god of authority, the minor gods of authority, a minor god of authority, the minor goddess of authority, the minor goddesses of authority, a minor goddess of authority, the superior god of authority, the superior gods of authority, a superior god of authority, the superior goddess of authority, the superior goddesses of authority, a superior goddess of authority, the inferior god of authority, the inferior gods of authority, a inferior god of authority, the inferior goddess of authority, the inferior goddesses of authority, a inferior goddess of authority, the ancestor god of authority, the ancestor gods of authority, a ancestor god of authority, the ancestor goddess of authority, the ancestor goddesses of authority, a ancestor goddess of authority, the ascendant god of authority, the ascendant gods of authority, a ascendant god of authority, the ascendant goddess of authority, the ascendant goddesses of authority, a ascendant goddess of authority, the descendant god of authority, the descendant gods of authority, a descendant god of authority, the descendant goddess of authority, the descendant goddesses of authority, a descendant goddess of authority, the transcendent god of authority, the transcendent gods of authority, a transcendent god of authority, the transcendent goddess of authority, the transcendent goddesses of authority, a transcendent goddess of authority, the future god of authority, the future gods of authority, a future god of authority, the future goddess of authority, the future goddesses of authority, a future goddess of authority, the present god of authority, the present gods of authority, a present god of authority, the present goddess of authority, the present goddesses of authority, a present goddess of authority, the past god of authority, the past gods of authority, a past god of authority, the past goddess of authority, the past goddesses of authority, a past goddess of authority, the god of authority, the gods of authority, a god of authority, the goddess of authority, the goddesses of authority, a goddess of authority, the half god of authority, the half gods of authority, a half god of authority, the half goddess of authority, the half goddesses of authority, a half goddess of authority, the vessel of authority, the vessels of authority, a vessel of authority, the person of authority, the persons of authority, a person of authority, the persona of authority, the personas of authority, a persona of authority, the personage of authority, the personages of authority, a personage of authority, the personality of authority, the personalities of authority, a personality of authority, the personification of authority, the personifications of authority, a personification of authority, the image of authority, the images of authority, a image of authority, the imagination of authority, the imaginations of authority, a imagination of authority, the belief of authority, the beliefs of authority, a belief of authority, the thought of authority, the thoughts of authority, a thought of authority, the word of authority, the words of authority, a word of authority, the action of authority, the actions of authority, a action of authority, the reaction of authority, the reactions of authority, a reaction of authority, the situation of authority, the situations of authority, a situation of authority, the circumstance of authority, the circumstances of authority, a circumstance of authority, the relationship of authority, the relationships of authority, a relationship of authority, the number of authority, the numbers of authority, a number of authority, the formula of authority, the formulas of authority, a formula of authority, the equation of authority, The equations of authority. A equation of authority. The symbol of authority. The symbols of authority. A symbol of authority. The color of authority. The colors of authority. A color of authority. The thing of authority. The things of authority. A thing of authority. The way of authority. The ways of authority. A way of authority. The place of authority. The places of authority. A place of authority. The time of authority. The times of authority. A time of authority. The event of authority. The events of authority. A event of authority. The result of authority. The results of authority. A result of authority. The crown of authority. The crowns of authority. A crown of authority. The authority king. The authority kings. The authority kingdom. The authority kingdoms. The authority king's subject. The authority king's subjects. The authority king's dominion. The authority king's dominions. The kingdom of authority. The kingdoms of authority. A kingdom of authority. The authority queen. The authority queens. The authority queendom. The authority queendoms. The authority queen's subject. The authority queen's subjects. The authority queen's dominion. The authority queen's dominions. The queendom of authority. The queendoms of authority. A queendom of authority. The authority prince. The authority princes. The authority princedom. The authority princedoms. The authority prince's subject. The authority prince's subjects. The authority prince's dominion. The authority prince's dominions. The princedom of authority. The princedoms of authority. A princedom of authority. The authority princess. The authority princesses. The authority princessdom. The authority princessdoms. The authority princess's subject. The authority princess's subjects. The authority princess's dominion. The authority princess's dominions. The princessdom of authority. The princessdoms of authority. A princessdom of authority. The leader of authority. The leaders of authority. A leader of authority. The follower of authority. The followers of authority. A follower of authority. The natural form of authority. The natural forms of authority. A natural form of authority. The supernatural form of authority. The supernatural forms of authority. A supernatural form of authority. The temporal form of authority. The temporal forms of authority. A temporal form of authority. The spiritual form of authority. The spiritual forms of authority. A spiritual form of authority. The age of authority. The ages of authority. A age of authority. The awakening of authority. The awakenings of authority. A awakening of authority. The realm of authority. The realms of authority. A realm of authority. The dimension of authority. The dimensions of authority. A dimension of authority. The purpose of authority. The purposes of authority. A purpose of authority. The manifestation of authority. The manifestations of authority. A manifestation of authority. The source of authority. The sources of authority. A source of authority. The origin of authority. The origins of authority. A origin of authority. The ancestor of authority. The ancestors of authority. A ancestor of authority. The descendant of authority. The descendants of authority. A descendant of authority. The lineage of authority. The lineages of authority. A lineage of authority. The forefather of authority. The forefathers of authority. A forefather of authority. The foremother of authority. The foremothers of authority. A foremother of authority. The mask of authority. The masks of authority. A mask of authority. The armor of authority. The armors of authority. A armor of authority. The champion of authority. The champions of authority. A champion of authority. The elemental art of authority. The elemental arts of authority. A elemental art of authority. The elemental science of authority. The elemental sciences of authority. A elemental science of authority. The elemental principle of authority. The elemental principles of authority. A elemental principle of authority. The agent of authority. The agents of authority. A agent of authority. The agency of authority. The agencies of authority. A agency of authority. The amplifier of authority. The amplifiers of authority. A amplifier of authority. The amplification of authority. The amplifications of authority. A amplification of authority. The aura of authority. The auras of authority. A aura of authority. The power of authority. The powers of authority. A power of authority. The authority of authority. The authorities of authority. A authority of authority. The might of authority. The mights of authority. A might of authority. The dominion of authority. The dominions of authority. A dominion of authority. The melody of authority. The melodies of authority. A melody of authority. The rhythm of authority. The rhythms of authority. A rhythm of authority. the dance of authority, the dances of authority, a dance of authority, the music of authority, the musics of authority, a music of authority, the spirit of authority, the spirits of authority, a spirit of authority, the people of authority, the peoples of authority, a people of authority, the mark of authority, the marks of authority, a mark of authority, the promise of authority, the promises of authority, a promise of authority, the vision of authority, the visions of authority, a vision of authority, the language of authority, the languages of authority, a language of authority, the sound of authority, the sounds of authority, a sound of authority, the secret of authority, the secrets of authority, a secret of authority, the knowledge of authority, the knowledges of authority, a knowledge of authority, the understanding of authority, the understandings of authority, a understanding of authority, the wisdom of authority, the wisdoms of authority, a wisdom of authority, the revelation of authority, the revelations of authority, a revelation of authority, the strength of authority, the strengths of authority, a strength of authority, the fortress of authority, the fortresses of authority, a fortress of authority, the city of authority, the cities of authority, a city of authority, the nation of authority, the nations of authority, a nation of authority, the civilization of authority, the civilizations of authority, a civilization of authority,